Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our second episode in our Linux series. First, let me just say thank you guys so much for the feedback on that first episode. It means a lot, and I'm excited to get started on today's episode. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to be talking about the Linux File System Hierarchy Standard. Now, you may be unsure why I'm bringing this up. Well, let's get started with some common questions about the FHS, or File System Hierarchy Standard. So, what is FHS? Well, a file system involves the methods and data our operating system uses for keeping track of all the information we store on our system. So, we make a file system when we create a partition or initiate a disk drive. Now, similar to Unix, Linux has a root directory represented by a /, and I'll show you how to get to it right here. It's as easy as, if you change your directory and use the tilde, that goes to your home directory. Well, if you change directory into the /, you go into your root directory. And if we do ls here, we can see some results. These are the contents of our root directory. Now, when working with Linux directories, it's important to note that they are case sensitive. And unlike Windows, when you install a file on a Linux system, the File System Hierarchy Standard is used to determine where to place the contents. Now, in particular, the FHS defines a way for those who create distributions, are software, or even system administrators to have a general consensus on where to store things and where files may be. And that's why I'm bringing it up today, because as you explore your file system through whichever distribution you're using in Linux, and as we continue in our series, we're going to see different distributions, we're going to see that this file system hierarchy standard goes throughout the distributions, and you should be able to use it as a standard when you're exploring these distributions. Now, as I mentioned, this enables them to, like developers and such, to assume things about where files or folders are placed on the system. Now, before we talk about these files and folders, let me explain some differences between them, such as there are a few terms I'm going to be throwing at you, like static and variable files. And before I get into that, let me also explain that there are even other types. In particular, 4 types in total we'll be exploring today. We got static and variable files, and then shareable and unshareable files. And I'm going to show a visual example here in a moment. But essentially, shareable files can be stored by one host and used by others, which means they are used across various systems or multiple systems. And this doesn't mean that it's shared by default. It just means that these are files that are expected to be shared amongst multiple systems. We're going to go more into that in here in a moment, so don't worry if you're not catching on right away. Then we have unshareable files, which, like I mentioned, it doesn't mean that it can't be shared, for example, over a network. It just means that these files on a particular host are unique to that host. Now, since we mentioned that it doesn't necessarily influence whether they can be shared or not, I want to give some examples of some of the folders and files that are shareable or unshareable. And these shareable and unshareable and static and variable files, these are defined by the File System Hierarchy Standard. And we're going to be looking more into that today. I have a web browser pulled up. We're going to be doing a search, and I'm going to show you guys some good resources to get started with learning about the FHS and what this all really means. So before we get started looking that up, let me give a quick explanation of what variable and static files are. So static files make up binaries, libraries, and documentation files. And typically, these static files do not change without intervention from the system administrator. Now, that doesn't mean that they're inaccessible, it just means that they might be read-only for typical users. Now, variable files are not static. They are written by the system and change dynamically as the system runs. So this could be, for example, the network status. The network status, because everything in Linux is kept track of as files, the network status may change and therefore a file may change, which you would then use that file to find out about the network status. So using these conventions, such as static and variable files, we can determine information about directories and files through these terms. So before we continue, I would now like to show you where you can learn more about FHS, and we'll get started exploring some of the directories for this standard. So let me go ahead and pull up my Windows capture here for my browser. All right, and all we're going to do is look up Filesystem Hierarchy Standard. You can even just type FHS if you would like. But let's see, Filesystem Hierarchy Standard. And for example, it says here it's a reference for describing the conventions used for the layout of the Unix system. So if you're wanting to take your skills to the next level in your knowledge, you need to know the FHS. It's going to tell you so much information. For example, like you can learn so much from knowing where certain files are stored, as everything in Linux is a file, whether it's a driver, the status of the system, information about the system, etc. It goes on and on. So in particular, I'm going to reference two websites here. There's certainly a lot of good at websites, as you scroll down. This is certainly one of them. Filesystem Hierarchy Standard Linux Foundation. So Linux Foundation is a great resource, and you might want to check this link right here to make sure you're going to the right one. We're going to open that in a new tab. Now, before we visit that page, I want to show you one more resource, which is the Linux Documentation Project. And they have a website that we'll be able to see as we scroll down. And notice there are other results. You could certainly use some of these other educational resources. For example, the Red Hat Customer Portal, I'm sure that's a good resource. All these resources are probably decent. Let's see, this is the Linux Foundation. That's what we just opened. I'm not really seeing it here, but it's TLDP. They're well known for their documentation. In fact, I'm going to type it to make sure it gets pulled up, because I wanted to show you guys that today. And here we go, the Linux File System Hierarchy, Linux Documentation Project. Now these are two great sources to learn about the File System Hierarchy Standard. And we're going to explore these websites temporarily before I get into more details about the File System Hierarchy Standard. So let's go ahead and click on one here. And you may notice, they don't have special CSS effects or anything. The websites are pretty basic. And this helps those who are visually impaired, because even they are able to learn from these websites with screen readers. And there's not a lot of content that isn't necessary. It's almost like reading a book. And for some people that may be a turn off, but we're going to go more. I'm going to walk you through just the essentials today. So, you can scroll down and it goes into all the information, such as, configuration files, purpose of certain directories. And you can just go on, and it goes through all the files and folders. And some of these may look familiar to you, such as the variable folder or the user folder. And it goes over all that information. And then right here we have the Linux File System Hierarchy Standard. And I'll actually be clicking on something here because I'll be using an example on their website as a demonstration. But look, it literally goes through every single folder, and it even mentions the root directory. Now, like I mentioned, if you're interested in Linux administration or learning more about your file system, these websites can be essential for your development and growth as someone who's administering Linux, whether it's for virtual machines or just on your local computer. So let's go ahead and do the forward, because I believe that's where their demonstration is. And yep, here it is. So as it mentions, shareable and unshareable folders and files, and static and variable. And it even has a short description right here that you could read as I'm talking if you would like. But in particular, let me explain a little more about what makes these directories shareable and unshareable. So for example, the user directory, that is a shareable directory, and it contains read-only data. So for a particular user, that directory may be accessible through multiple systems, which basically means that it may not be your local machine. It could be, for example, you could have a machine over the network that signs in through maybe an Active Directory service, and that's why it's shareable, because it's not unique to just the host machine. It's also could be relating to other machines. And it typically includes multi-user utilities, applications, and libraries. Now, then we have the etc. or etc folder. Now, this is an unshareable directory. Now, that does not mean that you can't share that directory over the network or that you can't show people, for example. It means that it's host specific, because the etc folder or directory has to do with system configuration files. So it's talking about your local host machine. That's why it's unshareable. It's not because it can't be shared. It simply means that it's unique to your host. So, we could go over the other ones here too. We got the optional directory. This is another shareable directory, and this contains add-on application software packages. We have the boot directory. Now, once again, it's unshareable because it's unique to the host. It contains static files that are required to boot the system. So this is explicit to the machine that is locally running. And these are the static directories. So these files are usually not changing. And then we have the variable directories. And this var/mail directory is the perfect example of what the difference is between static and variable. In static, the user directory or the configuration files are only going to change if the administrator goes to change them. Right here we have the mail directory or the news directory. Now, these directories, for example, this one is used to receive and store mail. So this may change even if you aren't actively doing anything, because if you receive mail, the mail that's received might be uploaded to this directory. And this is shareable because it may not be having to do with only the host. It might have to do with another user, for example, that uses Active Directory or LDAP, which is the Lightweight Active Directory Protocol. And that's on Linux. So this is some stuff that you may need to know. Now let's go, for example, we'll do this directory, the var lock directory. Now the reason this is unshareable and it's variable is because it's changing. And the way that it's changing is it's an unshareable directory because it's unique to the host, but it's variable because it basically defines what programs are using which device or file. So if a program is using, for example, I have a program OBS on my local system that's using this camera to record me right now. In Linux, it would be locking that device up to that program so that it would indicate like, hey, this is being used by the local device. And that's why it's unshareable. It's unique to the local system, but it's variable because if I stop using the device all of a sudden, then it's free and maybe other programs can use that device. So, and these websites are great for learning, and it might be a little complex. Some of for example, I struggled when I first read it, their examples. But I wanted to make it explicit here for you so you understand exactly what they're talking about versus shareable, unshareable, static, and variable. So now that we got that covered, we're going to explore Windows Subsystem for Linux in our Windows terminal. And we're going to, for example, find out about the commands on our local machine and our system information. So let me go ahead and close this browser here. Alright, and now we're back to looking at the terminal. Now, defined by the Filesystem Hierarchy Standard, the bin directory is a location that contains essential binaries. And these essential binaries are commands. So these commands are like ls for listing files, cp for copying files, and cat for concatenating the contents of a file into an output. So let's go ahead and explore here. we'll go ahead, we'll stay in this directory for now, but we'll do a list of the bin directory. Alright, that's not necessarily what I expected. Let's go ahead and change to the bin directory. And I'll do ls. See, now that we have all the results here, you can see there are a lot of built-in commands. And I mean, look how many there are. This can be overwhelming for a beginner, but don't you worry. In future episodes in this series, we're going to be walking through each command as necessary. For example, IP here, which is shorthand for checking the IP address. Or down here, if we scroll, I'm going to go ahead and use this scroll bar. We have some commands like change or chgrp, that's change group. Here we have chmod, change, basically these commands right here, they change the modifiers or the ownerships of the files. So you could change whether it can be an executable or not. And right here you can change who owns the file, such as which group owns the file or which user owns the file. So these are very useful commands and that you could all find here. For example, let's try the IP. I'm going to clear. See IP, and you can see that we have some options come up here. So if you do IP -4, it should give you the information about your IP address. So let's do, we'll do IPA. There we go. IPA for the address. This is shorthand, by the way. So you could do if config, but IP is the newer version, and you can do IPA as shorthand versus if config, and it'll give the address of your local machine. So as we can see, we got some network information right here. And this is in particular, we could do IPA -4. Let me try this way. There we go. Now IP -4A, this is giving us information about our IPv4 address. And you could do IP -6A, and this is information about our IPv6 address. So using this bin directory, we're able to see a whole assortment of commands at our disposal that are accessible on our local machine. Now, this is most useful when you're exploring new Linux distributions, or maybe using an older version such as legacy version. And you'll be able to use this bin in order to see what commands are accessible to you. This is so useful. Now let's go ahead and change back to our root directory. And as you notice, I did the / there and it took me right to the root directory. Now let's go ahead and clear the window again. We'll do ls. In this particular instance, we're going to go into the proc directory. Now, defined by the FHS, this directory stores some of our system information. So let's go ahead and change into that directory. Do change directory proc, ls, and here we go. We can see some information. So some of these are files, some of these are folders. So for example, the ones that have white text, those are files, and the ones with blue text are folders. So let me show you how to use this directory. And we're really just getting started here. There are so many directories. You can see your drivers for devices. You can see all sorts of things. So let's go ahead. We're gonna use cat here to concatenate the details in a file. So for example, let's use cat, and let's see, which one am I looking for here? So we're going to be looking for system info. I know it's here, but I'm not really seeing it. Let's just go ahead and type it. Oh, maybe it's in the system directory. Let's do ls system. Interesting. I thought I just used this command earlier. So let's go ahead and instead use cat. We're going to do version. So see, we're able to find out information about our local machine. In this case, it's what version of Linux that we're running. So there's so many useful things that we can do. Let me see if we could do, we're going to do clear here. We're going to do ls -l to list everything. Let's go through here. Let's see what else we can do. So we could do CPU info. Maybe that's what I was thinking. let's go ahead and do cat CPU info. And here we go. We have information about our CPU. Now, I know this looks a little long. I'm not going to go through all the details. Don't worry if it seems like a lot at first. But look, I have an Intel processor. It says that it's genuine Intel. Then we can see some other information such as the type of processor. I do have an i5 9400 CPU that runs at 2.9 gigahertz speed. Now, some people may have better, some people may have worse, depending on your system setup. So you're able to learn so much about your system, the configurations, and even when you edit your network configurations, when you're doing that, like even if you're doing it in a desktop environment, what's actually happening in the background is you're editing the files. So really being able to know about the file system hierarchy standard and how to navigate it is going to be so useful to you as an administrator, a software developer, if you're developing software as a vendor, and so on. So, thank you so much for tuning in today. Uh, I'm excited to explore more of the file system with you guys. We're going to be discovering the commands that are available to us, learning how to use them and apply them. We're going to create some scripts using the bash shell and some other shells. And this is going to be a great way to learn each command and how to perform tasks like administration tasks, backups over a network, and more. So we're really just getting started here, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in the next episode. So thank you so much again, and I'll be seeing you guys